Neil here in Chestandia, Romania, and we'll be picking up at Daniel chapter 11, verse 29. We've got through 28 after several sessions, and we've got probably 2 or 3 more to go, maybe. We'll see. But we're looking today at this is the race to control Egypt. We've got the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. We've talked about quite a bit. And you have the after the breakup of the Greek empire established by Alexander the Great, 4 of his generals took control. It split up in 4 different areas for these 4 different generals, and a lot of back and forth for a while, but finally 2 settled down to be the primary most powerful of those. One was done away with basically, and so you basically had 3. Greece itself was not that big of a impact as far as the other 2 go. They were still a power, but it was the Seleucids and the Ptolemies that this whole chapter is pretty much based on, for the most part of it, at least. And you had the king of the north coming against the king of the south, and the king of the south goes against the king of the north, and it's back and forth. And that's those 2 empires, those 2 kingdoms that were going back and forth. The Seleucid kingdom was basically Syria, and the old Persian Empire as far as to the east, and primarily. And then you had Egypt, which was the Ptolemaic Empire, and so they went back and forth for control. And as I've said before, you had the children of Israel, the Jewish nation there, Israel and or Judah and Jerusalem, always caught between the 2, and the control goes back and forth. They're never autonomous after. Basically, Alexander the Great, they were controlled by one of these 2 empires, and it switched back and forth for a while. And finally, looks like the Seleucids have the upper hand under Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the forerunner, or the type, may I say, not necessarily the forerunner, but a type of the Antichrist that we will see. Who knows? Could be soon. But in verse 29, and I've talked before about it's hard to separate. A lot of people make a separation point between verses 35 and 36. There is some, but it's just not that clean cut. There's a little bit of both, Antiochus and the Antichrist to come, mixed in both of those scriptures. And so you can't just make a clean cut there at that and say, well, here one ends and the other one starts. That's the way a lot of people present it, but it's just so intertwined that you can't do that. And so in verse 29 we'll pick up, and again we're talking about the race to control Egypt. Antiochus Epiphanes has ransacked the whole country. He took everything except pretty much except for Alexandria, the capital, and which is on the coast there of the Mediterranean Sea. And so in verse 29 we'll pick up, at the time appointed he shall return, talking about Antiochus, the king of the north, and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Now, formerly he just had total control of the country. He had his defeated it, and took advantage of young kings that had come up, and so he had just taken everything, taken the wealth from the country, and he needed that because Rome is coming into the picture more and more. And so verse 30 says, for the ships of Kittim, and that is Rome, shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved, and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. So we see that it says he shall be grieved and returned. Rome came into the picture, and the situation was that they were, Rome had been fighting with Greece and trying to get through Greece. They had already defeated Carthage years before. And Hannibal is right here on the scene in this battle. He may have been offshore when this, or not offshore, he's probably already in retreat by that time. But Antiochus, he had been in charge of his father's navy before. It was Antiochus IV that had he had used. So Hannibal was now out of the picture. He had been defeated in his naval battle. This naval battle, he was not present in. And so we see that, though, that there was a battle that they say was offshore. I haven't been able to find a whole lot of details on it. Is the reason for some of the lack of clarity on the naval battle there. I have seen indications, and some say that there was a naval battle, which in most cases that would be expected to be true, because, like I say, Alexander's on the Mediterranean Sea there, and both Antiochus Epiphanes and the Romans had quite a big navy, and so there had to be probably a battle, or if it was any battle. Now it could have been that when Rome showed up, then maybe the Seleucids just surrendered and let them come on in. That would have been the wise thing to do, probably. Well, I know it would have been, but and that may be the reason there's not a whole much that you can find on that. I'm not saying that it can't be found. I just haven't been able to find it, and very few people talk about it. But I did see something, and so I'd say maybe that's the reason you don't see much about it, because it probably was no real battle involved. But in any case, Antiochus has brought his army down, and he's ready to take Alexandria and to finish off the Ptolemaic Empire. His nephews were in control, and so he's just about to absorb Egypt into the Seleucid Empire, which would have given him more manpower, even more wealth there out of the city of Alexandria that he hadn't gotten the rest of the, what he hadn't already stripped from the rest of the country. And it would put him in much better shape to withstand the Romans, who had already defeated his father twice in two battles there. So here he's coming and with his army on his way to take Alexandria. And as I understand it, it was only a few kilometers from the city. And we'll see here, the two growing superpowers, or empires, are in a race to control Egypt. Antiochus Epiphanes knows if he secures Egypt, he stands a chance against Rome. Rome has been hindered by Greece, but knows they must stop Antiochus from taking Egypt. The ships of Kittim refers to, as I said, Roman ships. Now, by 168 BC, Antiochus had captured almost all of Egypt except Alexandria, and he was on his way at the time, like I say, to do that now, when within a few kilometers, a few miles from the city, he was met by a Roman consul named Gaius Popilius Lanus from about 589 BC until the last half of the century BC. Rome elected two Roman consuls to a one-year term, and they each controlled two Roman legions. and each had the power of a king. So in a sense, you had almost like, even though it was not a kingdom any longer, it was a republic, but they had the power of the kings. So in all essence, you had two kings ruling, but the Senate had the final say in those things. And it's said that when Antiochus drew near to Gaius Popilius Laenas, who had only a dozen or so officers with him, Antiochus reached out to shake his hand, and Gaius just ignored the gesture and instead began to read a directive from the Roman Senate that Antiochus was to withdraw and return to Syria. And by this time, Rome had finally defeated Hannibal, like I say, of Carthage, after he had destroyed two Roman armies and controlled most of the southern Italy for 15 years. Now Rome had begun to expand their empire into Greece, and Antiochus himself only ruled, at least in a sense, because Rome had permitted him to. They haven't been able to, of course, advance far enough to really take over the Seleucid Empire, but they defeated, like I say, his dad's army twice. And so Rome had already defeated, had those defeats against the Seleucids, and they were, receiving tribute from them. No doubt Antiochus was thinking that if he could add Egypt as part of his kingdom, and he could withstand Rome's expansion and maybe even defeat the Romans and maybe even take Rome eventually. When Antiochus said he would discuss it with his council or his friends, the Roman consul at that time took his walking stick, drew a circle around Antiochus, and said he wanted an answer before he stepped out of the circle. That may be the origination of the term, the line in the sand, the line that you're not to cross. And Gaius didn't just draw a line around or in front of Antiochus, but he drew it around him and said, I want an answer before you step out of that circle, before you do anything else. You're going to give me an answer. Now, there's some who have said that, and whether that part's true, I've just, some accounts say that at first Antiochus laughed at Gaius, how he intended to enforce such an order, seeing he didn't have an army, to which Gaius replied that he had the authority of the full Roman government and its largest army. Antiochus thought about it briefly and then turned to take his army back to Syria. And only then did Gaius Popilius Laenas extend his hand to Antiochus to shake his hand. So from there, Antiochus left Egypt and took his rage. I mean, he was embarrassed here in front of his whole army. He took his rage out on the Jews of Jerusalem. I've seen that happen on a personal level. I worked for 11 years in a prison system and retired there. I thought when I was going, I'd be there for a few years when the economy got so bad some years ago. And one day I was working, this is on the mental health wing of the prison. I was working in what we called the core area, where 3 day rooms holding as many as 48 inmates each split off, and they came into that core. And then you had a control room on the other side of that core, and kind of in the inner part of it, and an open area, what we called the core area. And then there was a door that led out to a break yard or smoke yard. That started out to be till they did away with smoking. But we had nurses that came out and set up some scales to weigh some of the inmates and to check blood pressures and things like that. And the easiest way to get done was to maybe catch them as they're on their way in or out from the break. And so they decided to do it that way for time's sake. And this one inmate, when this particular nurse was real kind of have bubbly personality, and she said, Robert, come on over here and let me get your blood pressure. And she turned around to get her blood pressure cuff, and the inmate come almost right up on her, and he said, you don't talk to me that way. Well, I put my hand between him and used the back of my hand to push him back, and he took issue with that too. He backed on up further, and he squared up then toward me, and he said, you don't put your hands on me, and very angrily. I said, well, the best thing you need to do is you just need to go back in your wing and just forget about this and everything else. You're not going out to break. Just go back into your day room. He decided he wasn't going to take me on. And whether it's because of me or whether it's just the color of the uniform I had on, knowing that there'd be others coming pretty quick if anything happened. But for whatever reason, he obeyed my order and went back into the wing. But here he'd been shown up in a sense. And these inmates don't like that. They like to think that they're in control. They want to appear in control. They want to appear strong, against... just like we have today, strong against the police, and so we had the inmates. They wanted to show like how strong they were against the officers, and they were going to pretty much do as they please as much as they can, always trying to get something over. But he went back into the wing, and so another inmate walked up to him, and he wanted to know what I said to him. Well, he. Like I say, he'd already been embarrassed, and he kicked that inmate right in the chest pretty hard. And I'd been told by one of our other officers, I'd seen him take his fist. He had some martial arts training. He'd take his fist and just miss another inmate's chin by that much. Very accurate. And he did that to intimidate the other inmates. He wasn't that big. May have been as tall as me, maybe an inch or so shorter, but he's stocky built, and like I say, he had that martial arts training. And the other officer told me to watch his. She said she'd seen him kick too, and said he can kick pretty high, and so to kind of watch his feet if I ever had to deal with him. Fortunately, I didn't, but he took it out on this other inmate, and so he took out his frustration there because he decided he couldn't deal with me. And so that kind of shows the same rage that Antiochus was in, and even more rage probably than this inmate had, because not only had he been shown up and embarrassed in front of his whole army, he hated the Jews anyway. And he'd been trying to get them Hellenized, which is, we talk about Hellenized, and people talk about that being the Greek culture. It's and it was, but it's really a very worldly culture. As I mentioned earlier, the gymnasium that Antiochus had built there in Jerusalem, just near the temple. Then you had to compete in Olympic Games there. They held the sports there, and they competed in the nude, and they were naked, and the people that went into the Colosseum that said that had to go basically with no clothes. And so this was against all Jewish teaching, and but he required it to be done, that everybody attend at least once a year. And so you can see the resistance that the Jews were giving for the most part, although many of them, just like today, we have the TV, the movies, and they're always pushing how far they can go with things, and they really, want us to run to the same excess that they do, because when we, as Christians, stand on our principles, then they are convicted, and they don't like that conviction. They're not going to accept God. And so when we refuse to give in, and I just tell you, if the things that are going on in America today, and this is a time here in June 7th, 2020, the riots going on all over the country about burning and looting and all those things. And there's so much involved there. Yes, it is about the death of a black man at the hands of a white policeman, but other groups are in it, and those are the one that are really pushing things. And so the burning and looting, and they're just mobs in this city and that city. There is more to it than that, because what a lot of them want to do, there are some groups in there that want to destroy Christianity, and we're the enemy, and you're the enemy if you're a child of God. Believe me, if the left gets control, that's what to do. Of course, don't want to get on that too much here, but you're a hated person if you're a Christian. You stand on your grounds, and that's the way it was with the Jewish people here. Antiochus hated the Jews because they were so devout in their worship to Jehovah God, and he was determined that he was going to turn them from that. And the more they resisted, the more angry he got, and the more he did. And he'd already put down one rebellion. When he comes back then, he's already in the rage, and he goes back to Syria and finds another revolt going on. And so he was in a rage when he came there. And he was frustrated. And then, so we go into verse 31 here. It says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." Now I'm going to stop right here. I've read the scripture, and so you see where we're going. And but I think this would be a good place to break at 20-some minutes. I started out trying to keep these fairly short. 15 minutes was my goal, but soon found a lot of it going to 20 and 30. And so I'm trying to shorten them if I can a little bit, so I think this would be a good breaking point. But Antiochus, like I say, he's turned away. The race for Egypt, Rome won it just in the nick of time. It was so it was like one of those races. If you're talking about a foot race or a something like that where they have a tape stretched, it was what we'd call a photograph finish almost, or an auto race of that sort. And literally as Antiochus was getting ready to mount siege and attack Alexandria, this Gaius Populus Lanus showed up just in time to stop and give them the edict that they were not to continue. And so we'll pick up here on the next session. Dale Little here in Chesnedea, Romania.